At this very moment, there are humans flying above our heads, stuffed into airplanes like tennis balls in a can, sitting peacefully among strangers for hours on end. It's remarkable that apes could achieve such a thing. I refer not to the technical achievement of flight, but the temperamental achievement of peace and confinement with strangers. The anthropologist Sarah Hrdy once imagined the catastrophe of attempting the same with a pack of our cousins, the chimpanzees. Quote, "Any one of us would be lucky to disembark with all 10 fingers and toes still attached, with the babies still breathing and unmaimed. Bloody earlobes and other appendages would litter the aisles." End quote. Given that we have every reason to believe our ancestors were chimp-like, through and through, it seems like our species has really improved our disposition in the interim. But then again, as Dale Peterson points out, a chimpanzee wouldn't deliberately try to bomb the plane, either. Dr. Richard Wrangham's book, The Goodness Paradox, notes the juxtaposition between these two true observations and reconciles them impressively. Our species lacks the reactive aggression, the impulsive and spontaneous violence of the chimp world, and yet we retain proactive aggression in a form of cold, calculated, deliberate violence. It is profoundly mysterious that our species is so much more affable and docile and cooperative than our chimpanzee cousins, and yet we somehow happily carry out deliberate, planned acts of violence that make the chimpanzee's worst demons look like angels. This behavioral imbalance is one of the great unsolved puzzles of our species. Today, I had the pleasure of speaking to the man who may well have put the pieces together. Today, I spoke with one of the world's most prominent anthropologists. Dr. Richard Wrangham is Harvard University's Ruth B. Moore Professor of Biological Anthropology, and he is the author of 3 extremely important books: Demonic Males, Catching Fire, and his newest book, The Goodness Paradox, which is linked in the show description, as it is the subject of today's conversation. It presents a compelling case for his fascinating theory that humans inadvertently domesticated themselves using the death penalty. You definitely don't need to have read the book to enjoy this conversation, but I couldn't recommend it more. Today we also talk about morality, religion, patriarchy, and psychopathy, among other things. You'll hear me pose some challenges to his hypothesis, but as you'll soon discover, he has thought his conclusions through to the finest detail, and that made for a wonderful conversation. And now it's my great honor to introduce Dr. Richard Wrangham. When most people use the word domesticated to refer to an animal, they're exclusively referring to pets or farm animals, and humans are conspicuously lacking owners. So could you explain for my listeners, when you say that humans are a domesticated animal, what do you mean by that?
I think the way to think about this is to go back to, it's even useful to go back 2,000 years. Aristotle said that humans are domesticated, and the reason he said that is because he was so struck by the fact that humans are relatively docile, relatively tolerant with each other compared to wild animals, but like domesticated animals. And then, if we skip 2,000 years and we come to Darwin, immediately prior to Charles Darwin, writing in the middle of the 19th century, you had the leading physical anthropologist of the day, Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, saying, yes, absolutely, humans must be a domesticated species, and they were clearly produced by special creation. Then Darwin comes in and says, well, if humans are domesticated, they must have evolved their domestication. Now, at that point, you start thinking about the fact that whatever happened in humans to produce our docility was kind of parallel to what happened in domesticated animals that produced their docility. And to answer the question, What I'm getting at here is the fact that it's the docility of humans that characterizes their similarity to domesticated animals. Now, as you said, most people think of domesticated animals as animals in the farmyard, animals that have been bred by humans for various characteristics, only one of which is tameness. But tameness is the feature that is the sine qua non, without which you just don't have anything in domesticated animals. And when you think about humans having parallels to domesticated animals, the obvious big parallel is the one that goes back to Aristotle, is our docility. So for me, domestication is the production of docility in an animal, which formally one can say is the evolution of a reduced propensity for reactive aggression, for like losing your temper.
Could you articulate the differences there between reactive and proactive aggression and how they're expressed in humans?
Yes, I mean, this is such a big thing, and it's amazing how long it's taken to penetrate the world of human evolution and biological anthropology, because for decades, people in psychology, people in biology have recognized that there are two fundamentally different types of aggression. They are proactive and reactive. They're sometimes called things like instrumental and defensive. There are various words to characterize this difference, but proactive and reactive, I think, captures it quite well. Proactive is the type that is planned, premeditated, often carried out quite calmly, whereas reactive is what happens when you lose your temper because you've got somebody threatening you, or being mean to you, or insulting your mother, and you lash out. So there's a big difference between these. The calmness of a predator in human terms, someone who stalks other individuals, makes it really a frightening, evil kind of aggression. The lashing out that a man does when he comes home and finds his wife in bed with another man, this is much more understandable. It's something we can all be rather sympathetic about. The difference between proactive and reactive aggression have been found in rodents to be related to different kinds of neural pathways. Very similar, very close, but nevertheless different. So different neurons are activated to some extent in proactive and reactive aggression. That isn't known for certain in humans because you can't do the kind of experimental investigations that you would need to prove it. But it seems very likely that the same thing is true in humans. And I mean, essentially, it's almost certain. So you've got these two types of aggression. And what's so fascinating is the thought that they can evolve separately. Because if they rely on different biological mechanisms, then you can have a species that has relatively high levels of propensity for proactive aggression, a great stalker, a great hunter, highly motivated to get its own way by planning hideous things on other individuals in the same species or sometimes different species. And maybe at the same time, low levels of propensity for reactive aggression, calm and not likely to lash out even under provocation. And that is exactly the combination that we have in humans, a high propensity for proactive aggression and a low propensity for reactive aggression.
Right. It's almost unfortunate that that aggression is used, the same word is used for these two different phenomena, especially in the context of them being so psychologically different and so independent from each other, both in an evolutionary sense and in a behavioral sense. And so what you're saying is that humans are a domesticated animal because our reactive aggression has been cut down so low. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. And it's a hypothesis that people have played with for a long time, as I said earlier. But I think that now we can start saying that we have a lot of confidence in it. And the reason is that we can understand a little bit about the mechanism that produces a reduced propensity for reactive aggression, the mechanism that leads us to be relatively tolerant and calm in the face of provoking stimuli. And those that mechanism is visible in the genes. So we're now starting to get, this is very new, just in the last 2 or 3 years, some evidence that humans show parallels in the genetic mechanism responsible for our temperament that are very similar to what you see in domesticated but not wild animals. But by the way, I really take your point about the fact that it's frustrating that you've got these two types of aggression that have got the same word, aggression. And the reason I sort of really resonate with that thought is that for centuries, people have been saying, are humans a highly aggressive species, or are we a very unaggressive species? And this is, a familiar sort of philosophical debate between the followers of Thomas Hobbes, who argued that we are indeed a highly aggressive species, and those of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who has come to serve as an icon for being unaggressive. And the fact that you've got the same word for these two types, proactive and reactive aggression, I think is what led to the confusion where people are fighting about, yes, we are aggressive, or no, we're not aggressive. And the answer is, well, we're both. We are highly proactively aggressive, and we're not very reactively aggressive. So I totally agree with you.
One thing that I found really convincing in your book, supporting the hypothesis that humans are domesticated, is the physical parallels between ourselves and farm animals. Would you mind going over some of those to kind of strengthen the case here?
Well, yes, this is a lovely thing, and it was brought to light by a New Zealand archaeologist called Helen Leach, who in 2003 wrote a paper pointing out that the way that people recognize whether the bones of an animal found from a few thousand years ago belong to a domesticated species or a wild species depends on 4 different characteristics. The first is, are the bones slightly smaller? Do they represent an animal of a slightly lower body weight than the typical wild animal in that species? Secondly, is there a reduction in the degree to which the males have exaggerated characteristics compared to the females? So have the males started to become more like the females? Thirdly, does the species have a short face and smaller teeth than the typical wild species? And fourthly, does it have a smaller brain than the typical members of the wild species? So these 4 characteristics, she pointed out, are the ones that enable an archaeologist to recognize when you're dealing with the bones of a domesticated animal. Well, guess what? All of those characteristics apply to Homo sapiens compared to our earlier ancestors. Now, Homo sapiens is a species that most people now regard as having originated about 300,000 years ago. But when it originated, it only started showing just glimmers of some of those features. So it showed a little bit of a reduction in the protrusion of the face, and the teeth look a little bit smaller. And then as you move forward from 300,000 years ago to the present day, it accumulated more of these characteristics in a more exaggerated way. One of the features that people are fascinated by, of course, is brain size, because we do not normally think of human Homo sapiens brains as being small in relationship to our ancestors. They are, in fact, smaller. They're smaller than the ancestors, and they're smaller than the Neanderthals that were living alongside us until 40,000 years ago, although in a different continent. And that looks like a really fascinating example of domestication in action, but we have to be careful with it because the reduction in the size of the body, so the total weight of the body, that was happening at the same time, another of those signals of domestication, may be so great that it accounts for the reduction in the size of the brain, which was somewhere around 15%, a reduction that's seen in European populations, in African populations, in men and women. So the important thing is that we got all of the four characteristics that people use to identify a domesticated species of dog compared to a wolf, or a cow compared to an aurochs, and so on. They're all found in humans compared to our earlier ancestors.
Right. I think that the case for humans as a quote unquote domesticated animal, or an animal suffering from or maybe not suffering, but an animal with the conditions associated with domestication, is pretty irrefutable. I mean, we have all these physical parallels, and we have the core parallel, which is this reduction in reactive aggression. How is it in your book that you describe how we became domesticated animals, given that we don't have a farmer over us breeding us?
This was the great puzzle that led Darwin to reject the idea that we had been domesticated, because even though he saw some evidence that suggested that we were, nevertheless he could think of no mechanism. And I think we owe the what I regard as the discovery of the mechanism to anthropologists who they've studied the pattern of social relationships in small-scale societies. Now, here's the phrase I want to introduce here: the present is the key to the past. And in this case, what I'm thinking of is how in small-scale societies, not identical to, but models of the kind of societies that we lived in the past, our ancestors back several tens of thousands of years, how did people respond when someone had a very high level of aggressiveness? And of course, I'm thinking here of reactive aggression, because our problem is, how is it that there was some kind of evolutionary force that tended to reduce the genes underlying reactive aggression? So we can ask, what happens? What happens if you are a hunter-gatherer? What happens if you're a small-scale farmer living in an isolated group, and someone is an intolerable bully? And it turns out that all sorts of people have answered this question from the point of view of studying what goes on in the society that they've been working with. And there's a very clear answer. The answer is that people come together within the society and whisper to each other that this guy is just simply intolerable. And they first of all start relatively low-level kinds of persuasion efforts. So they will tease him, they will cajole him, they will say, "Who do you think you are, Big Boots?" They will sing songs of derision in his face. They will do all these sorts of things that will make him feel ostracized and make him realize he's doing something just deeply offensive to the rest of the society. But some individuals do not respond to that. Some of them don't mend their ways. And they are people who I think that in our society we would call psychopaths. That is, people who just are not concerned with the impact of their behavior on other individuals. They have no moral restraints in that sense. And so they just carry on. They will carry on bullying their way around in the society, which might mean that they take food from other people's campfires whenever they want. It might mean that if they are men, which mostly they are, they try and lord it over others. They might just cavalierly punch someone and take their wife for the night. All sorts of just intolerable behavior. And if he continues in that sort of way, then there is a clear answer to what they do. They kill him.
Hmm.
He is executed. It might be by a very deliberate consensus of a series of men coming together and chatting when he was not there. Sometimes it even happens when he is there. Or it might be that it's obvious what's going on. People are whispered to each other, and somebody fires an arrow into his back, the victim's back, and knows that everyone else will approve of what he's done.
Hmm.
It tends to be that it's done by the kin of the victim, because in that case, there is no case for revenge afterwards. There is no desire on anyone's part to take revenge because, my brother was killed or my father was killed. So it's organized to be a consensus. Well, if that happens nowadays, then, as I say, I think that the present is a key to the past. And this would be exactly the kind of mechanism that we're looking for, because what you've got is a highly aggressive act, namely execution, which involves proactive aggression, being carefully planned, leading to someone who is intolerably aggressive being killed, and that can be expected to lead to an evolutionary selection against the genes underlying his aggressiveness. Sometimes his aggressiveness might involve some proactive aggression, but typically it will involve reactive aggression. And I say that because he is the kind of man, according to the descriptions that you see in these ethnographies, who, when challenged, very quickly fights back, loses his temper very quickly, and literally physically fights, trying to set him up as a sort of alpha male human. But these small-scale societies don't have alpha male humans. What they have is a sort of cabinet of the husbands who all work together, and there's nobody lording it over anybody else. So I think that we have here a mechanism that happens in humans and in no other species. That is to say, there is no other species in which males or anybody in the society can come to some consensus about the need to kill an intolerable bully and carry it out. And the reason that can't happen in other species is because the other species don't have language. Right. So, for me, all this comes down to language. It all comes down to the great mystery, which I have no solution for, which is, how did people get to start getting so sophisticated in their language that they could have these conspiratorial discussions, which were desperately important to organize well, and get away, therefore, with communally sanctioned murder.
Right. So your hypothesis is that after millions of years of tyranny, the alpha males have finally got their just desserts, as the subordinates have formed coalitions and killed them with the help of language. And over time, this decreased, quote unquote, alpha male traits, or let's say reactive aggression. And the selection against reactive aggression had the same effect that breeding farm animals does, is it just as surely removes reactive aggressive traits from the gene pool, and all the knock-on effects from domestication follow, right?
Beautifully articulated, absolutely, yes. And I think one of the interesting implications here is that, we have about 2 million years of ancestors who we put into the genus Homo because they looked basically very much like us, but many of them were more robust than us. And we've often thought that during that 2 million years, starting with Homo erectus, that you have a fairly steady increase in brain size. And so people think there's been a sort of fairly steady increase in becoming more like us today. Well, I think that's wrong, because when you think about this selection against reactive aggression, starting with Homo sapiens about 300,000 years ago, then up till you had that point, until then, you would have had alpha males. You would have had individuals who are much more like silverback gorillas, perfectly calm at times, but very quick to use physical violence in response to any kind of threat to his dominant status. So I think that that would be the time at which you get a whole suite of changes coming in. That basically, until 300,000 years ago, for 1.7 million years, we had ancestors that were very much sort of more in the animal-like existence. And humanity came in with a bang with Homo sapiens emerging 300,000 years ago. But as I said earlier, even that bang was fairly muted because you took time to get to the point where the aggression was really bred out of us as effectively as it has been by now.
Right. And so are we extrapolating just from modern hunter-gatherer societies? So you go through some incredible examples in your book about different hunter-gatherer societies and how they carry out executions and how that generally happens. And it seems pretty clear that, to my surprise at least, in these kind of nomadic groups, they can and do organize to kill obnoxious men. And is there any fossil evidence of coalitionary killings? Or is it just kind of this backwards extrapolation of, okay, this is how hunter-gatherers live today, and they live like this all over the world, so we can assume that ever since hunter-gatherers started being hunter-gatherers, they behaved like this?
Yeah, no, it's the latter. We don't have any direct evidence of that kind of capital punishment, and it'd be very difficult to imagine how you could get it.
Right.
Some people have argued that you can look at cave paintings or rock art and see evidence of people pincushioning. That's what they call it when a whole group of men fire their arrows at a single victim. And it's true that you see some pictures of that, but you don't know if that represented capital punishment or something more like war. So definitely the argument is based on the inference that the present is a key to the past.
Yes. Okay. Understood. And do you think so? One thing that I was kind of left wondering throughout, do you believe that there is a human impulse, perhaps especially among married men, to form coalitions to kill these obnoxious males? Or do you think it's kind of something that all cultures naturally work out as, I mean, I don't want to say game theory because I don't think the math's been done, but that all cultures kind of naturally work out that when these guys arise, those conversations have to start happening. Like, okay, what are we going to do about this guy? Or do you think that over this long course of time, 300,000 years, there's also been this reinforcement where, as often happens in human evolution, where something that may have started from a cultural innovation has actual biological adaptations? Do you think that human males now have a kind of instinct to kill wrongdoers?
I wouldn't want to go that far. I could see it's conceivable. I think it's also perfectly reasonable to imagine that they simply work it out every time. But I think it's true that it's pretty easy to work out.
Right.
So, there's a lot of people who reflect on human violence and look at occasions when individuals are very unwilling to use violence and think that humans are somehow bred in all circumstances to avoid violence. But that's clearly not true. There's also many contexts in which it happens very easily, and of course one of them is when your group is threatened by another group, and we all come together and we have a very strong tendency to react in a feeling of moral righteousness that it's perfectly okay to kill someone who has been a really serious threat to your group or your wife or your children or whatever.
Right.
There may be some sort of foundational aspects to this. So, for instance, we find in chimpanzees very clear evidence that the more chimps or the more males that there are in relationship to a single member of another group, then the more likely it is that they will attack that single member of another group. And the number that you see from the observations in the wild is about 8 to 1, where killing actually occurs. So if you have 8 on our side and 1 on theirs, then it's as if they lose their inhibitions and they're just very ready to attack, which is not the case if there are only 2 of them, say, to make an extreme example. And I could well believe that that sort of arithmetical calculation, as it were, has been somehow embedded in the cognition of chimpanzees, and that something very similar happens in humans. We are much more likely to be confident about committing violence if there are many of us and there's a huge imbalance of power in our favor compared to a victim.
I guess another question I'd have is, in many of the examples, and you mentioned it in this conversation, it's kin killing kin, where we'll see, like, one of the noteworthy examples you talked about was of a mother killing her own son for his misbehavior, and that being widely praised among the Inuit. He had slept with some man's wife, and then she strangled him in the night as punishment for this and other crimes. This seems fundamentally, the fact that it's often carried out by kin, this seems to kind of pose a challenge to the idea that this type of behavior could successfully evolve, as surely it would be more beneficial for the mother to defend her son and defend her genetic prospects in the process, no?
Yeah, that's such an interesting observation, and it does call for some fairly elaborate kind of assessment of the pros and cons of kin being involved. I think what you have to think about is that if the kin don't get involved, then there is a danger of an almost sort of mini genocidal kind of episode. That is to say, that if a man is not going to be somehow punished and, let's say, killed by his own kin, then it's entirely conceivable in terms of ethnographic evidence that he would bring his whole kin group down with him. In other words, he would be killed, and his wife would be killed, and his children would be killed, and his parents would be killed. The notion of hunters and gatherers as peaceful, tolerant, delightful people is absolutely right in terms of thinking about reactive aggression. But it's also clear that people living in small-scale societies develop huge sort of moral attitudes towards what's the right thing to do to kill people who are troubling them. And the notion of a witch is not precisely what you have in hunter-gatherer societies, but the essential idea of someone who has become outside ordinary human existence and deserves to be sent off to the witches. That is a very powerful idea. There's this huge tendency for psychological conformity in small-scale societies, which means that people who don't conform are risking their lives and the lives of all who are close to them.
Right. That makes sense. I totally understand why it makes sense to kill a man who is sleeping with everybody's wives and starting fights and bullying everybody. I totally understand how the logic works out that you want to kill them. And I also understand how the process of killing that man every generation, or even every 3 generations, over the course of some 12,000 generations, you're going to end up with a more docile species. So those two things make sense. But a lot of the times in hunter gatherer societies, they're killing someone for imaginary crimes. Like they're being executed by a group for performing magic or um, cursing somebody or doing some sorcery or being accused of being a sorcerer. What's going on there, and how does that fit into this idea of execution as a selective pressure?
No, that's a great point, and it introduces a new topic. So you're absolutely right that the ethnographers reveal a lot of these sort of arbitrary kinds of rule enforcement. The one I often think of is women who fail to note or maybe even don't know the convention about a male-only path, or about the vital importance that women never see the secret male trumpets, and women inadvertently come across these men playing with the male trumpets one day, or they inadvertently walk on the male-only path, and then the men say, "This is terrible. They've seen the male objects. What do we do with them?" And the men say, "Kill them at once." And they kill them. So this sort of thing is a long way from selection against reactive aggression. But I think that there are two huge consequences of the, call it discovery by men, of the ability to come together and proactively kill even a man who is individually capable of completely intimidating any one of them. The discovery that they can kill even this tyrannical despot means that they've also discovered that they can kill anybody they dislike. And those that they dislike can form into all sorts of different categories. But basically, they're going to be people who, for one reason or another, undermine the goals and ideals of this group of men, the men who've got the power vested in them by courtesy of being able to commonly agree on killing anyone. So that could be another man in the group who says, "You know what, I don't think we should do this sort of thing." And they say, "Wait a minute. You're not one of us if you think like that." It can be a woman who undermines the, as it were, the sanctity of the male group by doing something that exposes them to be the charlatans that they are. That the supposed ghosts of the past, who are actually men dressed up in masks, these are supposed to intimidate everybody into adopting a series of beliefs that ultimately are going to be beneficial perhaps to the group, but certainly to the men. And a woman who says, "Wait a minute, Fred, I know that's Fred, it's not the ghost of the past." He said, "Wait, that's a dangerous thing to do, because it risks undermining this tremendously important set of beliefs that sort of underscore the entire system of the society, the way it works." So, in short, you've got these two processes. One is just getting rid of the alpha male tendency. It's getting rid of it literally gets rid of the alpha males, and it, in the course of doing so, it leads to selection against the genes that underlie reactive aggression and domesticates us. That's one process. The other process is selecting for conformity, call it, selecting for individuals who are unlikely to go against the will of this cabinet of males. And I think that in this process, what we have is a far more potent account of the evolution of the moral senses, our sense of right and wrong, than anything else available. And this comes from an anthropologist called Christopher Boehm, who for the last 20 years has been pointing out that the capacity of a group of men in a small-scale society to eradicate anybody who disagrees with them, that capacity must surely have bred for individuals who are very willing to go along with the norms. So here you have an explanation for why people are given to modifying their behavior or deciding their behavior according to what they think is right and avoiding what is wrong. Well, what is right and what is wrong? What's right is what is approved by the power base in the group. What's wrong is what is disapproved by the power base in the group. And the power base is going to be men informed by their wives, doubtless, but ultimately it is the killers who are the power base.
So basically, the reason that humans have strong moral intuitions, in your view, is in large part to avoid getting killed by coalitions of males?
It sounds incredibly brutal, doesn't it?
Right.
It sounds so stark, but that is what I think. Yes.
Yeah.
I think we have a morality of justice, which is a sense of right and wrong in relationship to what the group thinks.
Right.
And, people have tried for years to make an argument that this all comes from a kind of exaggeration or crystallization of tendencies that you see in other animals, and obviously closely related animals like chimpanzees and bonobos are particularly of interest here. But I think that's wrong, because we have a morality of justice, a sense of right and wrong that is totally different from anything you see in any other species. And I think that for something that is so totally different, it makes sense that we need to have a unique selection pressure that has led to this. And that unique selection pressure is the ability to kill in this very peculiar circumstance of a whole series of people deciding together who should be killed.
That's fascinating. And one thing that I find confusing just about morals in general, that I'm wondering if you have any insight into, is that not just in hunter-gatherer societies, but even in like modern American society, all of our laws, essentially, when you dig deep enough, it goes to the Constitution, which is based on an appeal to magic, right? Like these rights were given to us by this invisible deity, and it's their will that we protect these rights, and everything kind of cascades from that. And so I'm certainly not. I'm certainly not taking any smug position when I say that in hunter-gatherer societies and in other societies, these moral laws, it's not a group of men saying, listen to us because we've got the sharp sticks and look how we just killed that alpha male. It's a group of men saying, listen to us because magical forces want you to. And it is their will that we wield these sharp sticks against you should you look at the magic trumpets or violate the right to bear arms or whatever it might be. What's the point in all that? Why do humans have this? And why do not only why do we make those appeals, but why do we find those appeals so compelling? Why is it that when someone makes a magical or spiritual case for why they should be listened to, it becomes so much more credible to apes like us?
Yeah, it's a fascinating question, and I mean, it raises a whole series of complicated issues, as you have identified. I suppose that the way I think about it is that if the men simply say, well, we've decided, ... then that it somehow is going to be more easily challenged. I mean, I don't really know that, but that's the way it feels.
Right.
I do know that in many of these small-scale societies, the men are worried about the possible threat to their power created by women.
Right.
And So this is reflected in origin stories, which talk about a time when there was chaos and women were in charge, and then the men got into power, and everything was good. And it was important not to go back to this, not to go back to women being in charge again. Well, the way to read this, I think, is that there are sometimes conflicts between what is good for the women and what is good for the men. And it's a power question. The men want to be able to retain the power. And if they can get everybody to believe in spirits that say it's good for men to be in power, then that's going to make life better from the men's point of view. I can't quite put my finger on why it is that that the argument can't be just sort of revisited in every generation. But it does certainly seem intuitively as though to be able to appeal to the spirits is somehow more effective. And what are those spirits? It seems to me that the way to think about a god in a monotheistic system is that the god is the personification. It's obviously a personification of something. It's conceived of as a person, an individual. So what is the personification of? It's the personification of the interests of the power base that is promoting the idea of the god.
Right.
And that is males. All of these belief systems are clearly very much organized by, well, at least they clearly benefit males. The males are given the power by the spirits, so it makes sense that they've culturally evolved to be able to justify the fact that the males are in power. So this is, I think, it's getting towards the question of how it is that there are divine spirits that somehow sanction the kinds of behaviors that we're talking about. But there are still gaps that have got to be filled in.
Yeah, I think so too. So one thing that's so interesting is that we've seen that bonobos have gone through the same process of self-domestication, but instead of coalitions of tyrannical males, there were coalitions of defensive females. Why is it that, and maybe in the course of things this might turn out to happen, so in our species, coalitions of males overthrew the alpha male position, but it seems feasible from the outside that even in really patriarchal societies, if females banded together, then the coalition of males would become moot, because suddenly the only way to attain reproductive power would be to cede to the coalition of females' demands. So why is it that we haven't seen in the tremendous diversity of cultures throughout history? How come we haven't seen a case where there's been a matriarchy or something like it, where females have banded together and said, okay, well, we're not going to cooperate with you unless you cooperate with us? Because in your book, you detail just these horrendous tyrannies across the world of males over females, in which the sexual and physical abuse is absolutely horrendous. And it seems confusing as to why there hasn't been a reckoning of sorts.
Yeah, it's a obviously speculative issue. I think that most people would say that the big problem for female coalitions in humans is maintaining them in the face of the need or the value to females of forming dyadic relationships, one-on-one relationships with males. So, the females could cooperate together and use coalitionary proactive aggression, conspire together, make a plan, get rid of one man at a time, as it were, if they wanted to, and certainly the alpha male at least. But the coalitions among females are always going to be fragile because males have got something to offer females, and what they offer is resources. In all these societies, men are bringing in valuable resources. They're valuable meat or honey or other kinds of foods to the females. And it's very clear, even though, in our sort of wish to reject a patriarchal world nowadays, it's still very clear that males were really beneficial to females in small-scale societies. And so I think, there is this pressure on females, not only to take advantage of female cooperation at times, but also to take advantage of male cooperation. And that would seem just to undermine the capacity of females to maintain a steady coalition at the expense of males.
So just to push back on that a little bit, it's certainly true that in some societies, as you know, males are providing most of the material resources in the form of food. But in other societies, females are providing most of the calories. So wouldn't that give them even more leverage? Like they've got reproductive control, as bonobos do, and they've got equal and in many cases greater resource control. Is there no lever for them to pull to say, hey, if you guys want relationships with us, if you want all the food that we gathered all day, we're going to have to start following rules that are a little less tyrannical? Why hasn't that happened?
It is kind of amazing, and I accept entirely the point you're making. Australia is the great continent of hunter-gatherers, all hunters and gatherers until just 300 or 400 years ago. And in North Australia, you had people living in societies in which women produced the great majority of the food, just as you were saying. And then, you might think, as you were saying, that this would be a place where women would somehow control things. They did not at all. And in fact, it was the opposite, because men were freed by the fact that their wives were producing all the food for them. Men were free to do other things. And what they did was to spend a lot of their time organizing coalitions competing for women. The net result was you had incredibly polygynous societies. So, sometimes people think of hunters and gatherers as leave it to beaver families, just with mom, dad, and the kids. But that's not always true at all. And there in Northern Australia, you had men who would have sometimes 10, sometimes 15 wives. Well, this, of course, created huge problems in terms of keeping off the bachelors who might be wanting to cuckold the men, and in keeping the women in sight, literally, at night in a circle, so that no funny stuff was going on. The arrangements involved basically men helping each other with the defense of these women. All sorts of alliances built up among the married men. All the girls, when they were born, being assigned to a husband, I say assigned, but negotiated over and then assigned to a husband who at that age would be something like 25 if he was lucky, because this intense polygyny meant that there were lots of unmarried men, and they were, of course, all the younger ones. So if you could get a baby girl to be promised to you as your wife by your age of 25, then that would be great. That meant you would start breeding about the age of 40 when she was 15 years old. So this became an elaborate system of male-male competition in which the females were particularly disenfranchised.
Yeah, that's a shockingly counterintuitive result, and obviously it's horrifying how kind of how thoroughly patriarchy has wrapped its fingers around every society it's touched. It's one thing that you wrote in your first book, a kind of recommendation in your book, Demonic Males, which really explored this kind of, I don't know if I'd say evolution of patriarchy, but certainly the evolution of the worst tendencies in our species, which are to a massive extent clustered on the male side of the aisle. You recommended that we kind of follow suit with the bonobos and try to enfranchise women, and specifically enfranchise women in positions of power. Are you still optimistic about the potential of that as a means of reducing violence?
Yes, I think I am. It's it's going to happen very slowly, and I guess the reason I hesitate is because I'm always fearful of any generalization that doesn't take account of kind of local, historical, ecological influences. In other words, among the liberal global elite, one can easily imagine that there will be a continuation of women getting more power in business, more economic power, and slightly going along with that, more political power. We're seeing more political power in the parliaments of the Scandinavia, in Rwanda, in USA in general. So that could all keep going. On the other hand, you've got to be careful about the fact that there are other places in the world in which you see the opposite, and the explosion of a new society in I was going to say the remains of Syria, but in the Syrian problem, the ISIS group, that was incredibly sexist and incredibly unpleasant to women in all sorts of ways. And there are other societies in the world where patriarchy is showing no signs of disappearing. So, it's to say that it seems reasonably likely that women are going to continue getting more political power is also a statement of faith in the liberal global system.
Right. I like to kind of think about the possibilities of how this would work given how we've structured our systems so thoroughly historically, that you could certainly see that we will, I think, see more female enfranchisement and see more women in power. And I think that's an inherent good, just because it doesn't seem to make much sense from any perspective to have half of the society systemically underrepresented. But I could really see it be the case that these traditionally patriarchal institutions kind of see women take up patriarchal roles within them, or to take up recapitulate these violent, hawkish tendencies that men have established, recapitulate them, except as a woman. It's like the extreme version would be, we want more female concentration camp guards, right? I worry about that, and I did look out of curiosity after reading that book, and this was an analysis that was done after, that showed that at least in Europe, female monarchs generally were more violent than their male counterparts, like you think of Queen Victoria and the like. So it's hard to know whether these systems can become unfixed by gender parity at this point in their existence.
Yeah, no, that's fair enough. But I don't think we should be too depressed in that sense. I think it is also clear that if people are trying to create peace between two warring states and more women are involved, it turns out that peace is more likely to occur.
Oh, really?
Yes. And in the case of the monarchs, that's an individual who is in a very patriarchal world. So it's not that surprising that a woman might indeed have to behave in that patriarchal world in a rather man-like way in order to be able to survive at all. I think if we think about women becoming more numerous in the institutions, then there's every reason to think that things will get better and more peaceful. The great difficulty, though, just to come back to this, is that if the institutions decay, if there are revolutions that get rid of the ancien régime, and then you get chaos for a bit. In that chaos, you're very unlikely at that time, I think, to get strong women-led institutions. And I suppose that's probably partly my gut feeling from thinking that there are inherent problems due to maleness and femaleness, the domineering goals of males and the willingness of females to go along with them. And also just because of what you see, look what happened when Gaddafi was killed and Libya dissolved into a whole series of militias. Those were militias that go back to typical male-led social organizations with all the patriarchy that we're trying to get away from.
That's a very good point, because even if the pessimistic view of it were true, the only way forward would be to incorporate women into existing institutions, because the process of overthrowing those institutions would inevitably be violent, and violence throughout all of history has become, I would say, inevitably male. And so the best way to guarantee patriarchy is to have a revolt.
Yeah.
So point taken for sure. And I'm glad to hear that there's evidence for female-led peace coalitions being more successful. And that doesn't surprise me. Frankly, the European monarchy study, actually, those results surprised me. So I do have another question that I missed while going through my list of things I wanted to talk to you about earlier. One thing that you pretty thoroughly detail is this idea that in hunter-gatherer societies, we see selection against reactive aggression. Like, if you want to get killed in a hunter-gatherer society, the best thing that you can do as a man is to become overreactive, to lash out, to fight. But one thing that's so strange is that in modern societies, we tend to be so much more sympathetic towards those who express reactive aggression, and we're so much more callous towards those who instigate proactive aggression. Like, to give an example, and I'll use one that you said earlier yourself. If a man comes home and catches another man with his wife and he kills that man, he'll probably still go to jail either way, but he'll roundly be viewed as someone who has had an excessive and even evil outburst, but one that is at least understandable to a normal human being. But someone, on the other hand, who expresses high proactive aggression and commits the same crime, killing somebody, a Ted Bundy figure, that person is... I remember watching a documentary about Ted Bundy and feeling kind of unusual happiness at seeing that he had been executed, which is completely out of character for me, but I would not have felt the same emotions if it was, we're going to execute this guy who killed someone who he caught with his wife. That would not be the same. I wouldn't, right or wrong, I wouldn't have the same subjective reaction. So if execution is primarily a mode of reducing reactive aggression, why is it the case that I feel, and I think other people as well, feel so much more sympathetic to reactive aggressors versus proactive aggressors?
I've pondered the same question myself. And I think that the conclusion I've come to is that this is not really something to do with our evolutionary past, so much as the more immediate implications of the two different kinds of aggression. The great thing about reactive aggression is it. You know if somebody is the kind of person who is going to lose their temper easily. With proactive aggression, you don't know. It's all held in. We could have a murderer among us who is thoroughly pleasant and who plots his murders in a way that leaves us entirely innocent of when they're going to happen. So I think it's just that it's scary to have a proactive aggressor, and we want to get rid of them because, not because of some kind of ancient evolutionary motivation, but simply because nowadays to have someone whose motivations you just don't understand, whose goals you just don't understand because they're so hidden, is literally risky for you.
And so in hunter-gatherer societies, do we see the killing of proactive aggressors?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Proactive aggressors are killed as well. I think that, it's incredibly difficult to have any kind of mathematical analysis, quantitative analysis of this, and many men will be relatively high on both scales, both reactive and proactive aggression, and some more on one than the other. And you can say that there are definitely cases of men who have plotted to kill others, being eventually killed themselves. My sense of the evolutionary implications there is that when a group of executioners kills someone who has himself been a private executioner in his own interests, then it's kind of a wash, that there is no impact evolutionarily. Proactive genes get rid of proactive genes. It's only when the victim of capital punishment is primarily a reactive aggressor, either as well as or independently of proactive aggression, that you have the evolutionary effects.
So you'd still have, even if it was perfect equality there, in terms of the execution rates of reactive and proactive aggressors. In one case, it would be neutral. In the other, that works.
Yeah. In the original sort of problem of getting rid of the alpha male, I think about chimpanzees, because what's so striking about chimps is, they can be perfectly tolerant and sort of have a lovely time just lolling about in the afternoon sun, playing with each other, the males, and grooming and so on. But if somebody irritates the alpha male by not being as submissive as he should be, which is every time he meets him, he's got to say, "Okay, you're the boss," by bobbing at him or extending a hand or giving the right grunt, that sort of thing, he just loses his temper incredibly quickly. In other words, what I see with the chimps is that the alpha males are, what really marks them is that they are reactive aggressors. They're just incredibly ready to just charge at someone and attack them and pull them about and pound them. And I assume I guess I assume. Anyway, that is what I infer happened with our ancestors until you got to Homo sapiens.
Right. And language allowed the normally subordinate males to say, okay, we've had enough of this guy.
Exactly.
Fascinating. And do you think that this has been... Well, it's hard because I'm not even sure if you believe in a moral system, given your view of how it arose in the first place. So I won't presume there. Do you believe that morality is, when it comes down to it, this kind of fiction that's based on a collection of different fitness benefits, ultimately subservient to imaginary beings invented by self-interested males? Or do you also have this, independent of that, do you also have moral ideas where you can say, okay, this is for the better or for the worse?
Well, I guess I'll prevaricate and say both. Your first alternative is the analytical perspective. The second is the lived and felt perspective.
Right.
So I think that what has happened is that our moral senses have evolved so that when we are guided by our own personal sense of right and wrong, we don't have to think, it makes sense from my own self-centered perspective to do what people are calling right, because if I don't, then I'm going to get into trouble. It makes sense instead that we have evolved a a series of moral intuitions. And those moral intuitions are real. We really feel it's right.
Right.
So, I can look at myself and say, here's why your moral sense of right and wrong has evolved. And here's why, in terms of the cultural upbringing that I had, that I have absorbed some things that I think of as right and some things that I think of as wrong. I can, do all that floating above my body and looking at myself.
Right. And is that difficult when you're holding this kind of naturalistic view of morality? Is it difficult for you to kind of maintain the idea that morals are worth following and worth listening to?
No, I don't think it's difficult at all.
Good.
I mean, it is clearly difficult for some people.
Right.
And they are people that we call psychopaths.
Right.
They are people who, if they follow morals, they do seem to go through that kind of analytical process to work out what other people would think is the appropriate moral behavior, and then, depending on circumstance, they may or may not do it. But I think it's fascinating that such people exist, and the reason I think it's interesting is because it seems possible that they represent what our ancestors were like.
Right.
That is to say, the typical definition of a psychopath is someone who does not feel the moral restraints that the rest of us do. And so the 1% of males that are like this, and the much smaller percentage of women, they seem to me quite plausible models of what Homo heidelbergensis or Homo erectus or Neanderthals would have been like. People who were smart, yet so competitive to make sure that they got what they wanted, that they did not care about the impact on anybody else. And they could afford to be like that because there was nobody going to kill them if they carried on like that.
If we view them as individuals who are disabled in the sense that they lack the important social traits that we've gained over the past 300,000 years, that's a fascinating prospect. I've also heard from other people interested in this topic that psychopaths might, and two things can be true at once. Like I actually see these as compatible ideas, but that psychopaths could potentially be kind of a frequency dependent strategy where when there's not so many of them in the environment, you can kind of get away with being a freeloading alpha male type. What do you think about that? Or do you think it's purely just a disability?
That is the standard theory. If you look up evolution psychopaths, that's what you'll see. The notion that in a world in which most people are moral, then there may be a position, a selective opportunity for individuals who take advantage of the moral ones. The reason that I hesitated there is because I thought about this in terms of the numbers of people who are in prison. And I have seen estimates saying that the probability that psychopaths end up in prison is so high that possibly 2/3 of all of the people who reach a critical diagnosis of psychopathy are in prison. Now, that may be too high, but nevertheless, it is certainly the case that people in prison are overwhelmingly more psychopathic than people not in prison. The implication is that psychopaths actually don't do very well, because the implication is that if you're in prison, you're going to have much poorer evolutionary success in terms of number of children and the success of those children.
Is it possible that psychopaths are just reproducing younger and with greater frequency, and that's compensating for any effect that comes with being put in jail?
It is possible that psychopaths are doing reasonably well, or even better than average, despite their being in prison. So that's what I was going to say, that we have to be cautious about the fitness implications, to use the technical terms. But so that is why I am dubious about the notion that that psychopathy has evolved as an alternative strategy in a world of non-psychopaths that does well. But it should be possible to get data on this, and I just haven't seen any data so far. And the data would be the question to know how well psychopaths do reproductively.
And that would be extremely difficult given that the normal samples that psychologists use for psychopaths, they're found in prison and they're found in the context of a modern industrialized society, which is the success rates could be completely different. You would need to be able to somehow identify psychopaths in a hunter-gatherer society where, as you note in your book, people like that want to hide themselves for good reason. So,
Yeah,
I'm not sure if the prospects are good.
That's right. But it's a kind of an interesting thing to play with in terms of thinking about our evolution as a species. And as I say, the notion that we were all psychopaths once is, I think, a viable alternative to the notion that we've always been nice and now we've got a few psychopaths that are taking advantage of us.
Yes, I agree. And do you think, looking back at all this in the grand scheme of things, that human domestication or self-domestication has been a good thing?
I think it's been a terrific thing. I think that basically all the best kinds of aspects of humanity come from our domestication. That, I've studied chimpanzees all my career, for 40 years or so, and I love them. It's just an incredible thrill to be with them, and I admire them. They're tough, and life is difficult, and they make the best of the situation they're in, and I'll go to the wall to try and help them. But to be a chimpanzee is a brutal life compared to being a human. And the reason it's brutal is partly because there's just a tremendous amount of aggression all the time. There's a lot of wounding. There's a lot of chasing and screaming. There's a lot of death. Humans have emerged into an astonishingly benign environment compared to what I see in chimpanzees and what, for the reasons we talked about, I think we can infer in our earlier ancestors. I think we're incredibly lucky to have gone through this period of self-domestication, even though it happened as a consequence of more violence, of the executions, that at times would have happened relatively rarely, but at times probably happened rather a lot, unpleasantly a lot. So I wouldn't like to have been around during that period very much, but to be alive at this present time, when we have undergone already 300,000 years of self-domestication, and we now live in a society in which we ban executions and in which we have institutions that work desperately hard to try and maintain social coordination without the need for violence, is just a phenomenal thing to find ourselves as part of. So yes, we're not quite at the level of flop-eared domesticated rabbits, but we have gone a long way in our self-domestication, and we're very, very lucky as a result.
So that's interesting. So you simultaneously hold the position that for the past 300,000 years, execution was, on balance, quite good. But today, it is also good that we've stopped this selective force?
Yes, I'm selfish. If I was going to be really thinking about the nature of the species, say 100,000 years from now, then maybe I would take some, really unpleasant approach and say, hey, let's go big time and execute anybody who is violent, who is nonconformist, who is typically old-fashionedly male. You can start inventing the ideas. In other words, let's go for a system of eradication of genes that has the prospect of leading to a delightful species in the future, because we haven't quite got there yet. But I'm selfish. I want to live a pleasant life now. I want my children to live a pleasant life now. I want society to work now as well as it possibly could, rather than having to go through all of the unpleasantness with the prospect that there will be even nicer species in the future.
I share your intuition that, on balance, execution for the past 300,000 years has been a good thing for our species. It's what made, on your account, which I agree with, it's made morality possible. And morality is the best psychological thing that animals have come up with. But at the same time, if someone proposed doing something like this intentionally, I would view them as a monster. Once we have this knowledge of how the death penalty can affect the species, it seems that continuing to use it deliberately in the context of this knowledge is on par with eugenics, and that's horrifying.
We're clearly on the same page. I would be horrified to think that people can use an evolutionary analysis to justify execution nowadays. The problems with execution are many in terms of today's society. From what I have read, it does not work in terms of discouraging the kinds of crimes for which people are executed. It's actually more expensive than imprisonment. It just seems a thoroughly bad idea. And I'm hoping that people can think about the fact that it's had these extraordinarily positive effects in our evolution without for a moment thinking it's a good thing nowadays.
And do you think that there will be, as a result of increasing liberalization, reducing, I live in America, so we still have the death penalty. We're living in the Stone Age over here, but in terms of the death penalty largely appearing to be on the wrong side of history and largely appearing to be on its way out, if you look at kind of the grand scheme of things and you're optimistic about the future of liberalism, do you think that there will be kind of to any extent, a recession in our species where suddenly being an alpha male becomes slightly more advantageous than it was in a hunter-gatherer context?
Well, as Frank Fukuyama discovered when he wrote his book, The End of History, predicting is a lot harder than when you're thinking about the future than when you're thinking about the past. I can see that there may be circumstances in which leaders are often killed. And in fact, even in the 20th century, there was an astonishingly high rate of leaders being killed, also being in fights themselves and surviving them. So there is a sense in which there's some kind of sort of loose parallel with the alpha males nowadays and what we saw in hunter-gatherer society. But there is this massive difference that makes me very nervous about any kind of real sort of comparison of presidents and kings with the eradication of alpha males during our period of self-domestication. And that is that the alpha males that we're talking about in animals are individuals who use their personal physical strength to suppress anyone who is a rival. And they actually literally have to physically fight. Whereas the alpha males that we're talking about in humans are quite different. They are leaders of coalitions. And, Donald Trump has not been in a physical fight with Hillary Clinton, nor has Joe Biden, and nor has...
They were threatening at one point. Joe Biden said, in high school, I would have liked to take him around back and punch him in the face. So
yes, right.
Perhaps there's still a little bit of that chimpanzee left over in our current leaders.
But the fact that that is a joke, just brings home the fact that it's totally different. And so the way we get rid of those alpha males is somewhat similar to the way that our alpha males in the prehistoric past were removed. but the nature of the alpha male behavior is totally different.
Right. Well, that's good and comforting for the prospects of removing the death penalty and not seeing the monsters in our closet come back out. So I have one final question for you. This is another thing that I find interesting to think about. I'd never heard. I had been, before reading your work, pretty thoroughly convinced of the alternative theories of how morality evolved. But I found your alternative analysis very convincing. The only point where I felt I was struggling was observing how, so if morality evolved, if our moral intuitions and our moral feelings evolved mostly as a tool of conformity to avoid the wrath of these male coalitions, why is it that for so long we've seen people take enormous personal risks and be anti-conformist in the extreme based on explicitly and exclusively moral impulses?
So the kind of example you're thinking of is Luther.
Civil rights, as an example. Any case where any of the, like the suffrage movement, the civil rights movement, any of these cases where we've seen people put themselves at personal risk and be anti-conformist to the establishment on the basis of moral intuitions. How does that gel with this idea that morals are an explicitly conformist tool?
There seems to me that the great problem of morality, once you get into societies of large enough that you have multiple kinds of group interests, multiple kinds of groups, each with their own interest, you then have repeated moral clashes, because your moral sense of right and wrong is going to be in relationship to a group. In the hunter-gatherer group, there's just one group. Basically, it's the men, modulated to some extent by the women. But once you get into some of the larger farming groups, then now you have alternative kinds of groups to which you owe some sort of allegiance. And they will sometimes have different views of what is right and what is wrong. So when you talk about individuals taking great risks, then it seems to me that you can think of them as performing what they think of as morally right in relationship to one group, which would probably be the challenging group, the suffragettes, because they've had to choose between what's right and what's wrong, and they prefer to go with Group A rather than Group B. Why do they prefer Group A to Group B? Presumably there's some kind of internal calculus that says it's time for this to happen, and if it works, it's going to be wonderful. We'd have to get into some kind of analysis of how often those risks pay off to be able to substantiate the notion that it is an adaptive calculus. So I don't know if it is. But the sort of core point I would make is that in contemporary society, in any kind of state society, and some of the much smaller societies, the fact that we're beholden to or members of different kinds of groups that have their own different moral standards is what puts us into all these moral dilemmas. And sometimes we will find ourselves taking risks on behalf of one set of standards, even though it jeopardizes with the other.
That makes sense. Anyway, what's next for Dr. Wrangham?
Oh, I'm doing some stuff with chimps right now, which is really fun. We're actually, this is a long way from what we're talking about right here, but we have, last year I was in Uganda and saw a behavior that I'd never seen before, which looks as though it might be using a psychoactive plant
Really?
for its psychoactive purposes. Yeah,
Wow. Oh my God. A chimpanzee.
a chimpanzee.
What plant is it?
It's a tree which occurs in all of the different chimpanzee habitats. It's called Pseudospondias microcarpa, and humans use it. It helps to send them to sleep. It calms them, reduces anxiety. And the chimps that we have in our community are the only ones that have so far been reported to use this. So, it's a really fun thing because it looks like not just using a drug, but it's a drug culture.
That's fascinating. Wow. That'll be interesting, and it'll be a shot across the bow for, this isn't a theory that's popular in professional anthropological circles, but certainly on the internet and outside of academia, you'll hear a lot of people who believe that the reason humans became humans is because we started taking psychoactive drugs, and that somehow changed our intelligence or personality.
I'm dimly aware of that and don't want to feed it.
Yeah, I'll edit this part of the conversation out perhaps, but I think that's
Okay.
but if you can prove that chimpanzees are taking psychoactive materials, then Terence McKenna will be defeated in that area.
Okay. That's funny.
Richard, it's been such a pleasure to talk to you. I really appreciate you coming on the show.
Wonderful questions, Mac. No, really great conversation. Thank you so much.
Oh, well, look, if the questions are wonderful, it's only because your research has it's been so influential in my thinking. I hope you keep it up. I look forward to whatever comes out of this this chimpanzee experiment in drug use.
Great. Okay.
That's our show. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed that conversation, I recommend you read Dr. Wrangham's book, The Goodness Paradox. I've linked it in the show description. It's a fantastic read, and if you're left with any questions about his theory after listening to this episode, chances are I didn't ask them because he answered them thoroughly in his book. And lastly, thank you to the donors who make this show possible. You'll notice that Dr. Wrangham sounded like he was calling in from the BBC, and that's not just his accent. The donors have given us the budget to set our guests up with proper recording equipment, and I couldn't be more grateful to them for that support. I'll talk to you again on Sunday. Until then, have a great weekend. And remember to be kind to animals.